This is the sixth of the market failure series in microeconomics IB. This video will discuss the problem of common access resources and the threat to sustainability. It will introduce and define both problems and see how they link, and explain a couple of examples in which such problems are present. So let's first introduce the concept of common access resources. Common access resources are typically natural resources like fishing grounds or forests or pastures or even man-made systems for managing natural resources like irrigation systems. Usually these resources are very difficult or very expensive to exclude people from consuming them. Therefore, they won't be provided by the market. And because there are no price signals, individuals will only take into account their own private costs and their own private benefits of consumption. So there tends to be a problem of overuse and overconsumption of these resources. This may lead in the long run to the depletion of this natural resource or this man-made system for managing a natural resource. And this is a form of market failure. This form of market failure is sometimes referred to as the tragedy of the commons. This brings us to our second problem, which closely links to the problem of common access resources, and that's the problem of sustainability. So, as I said, this problem is closely linked to the concept of common access resources. Sustainability is basically defined as being able to meet the consumption needs of the present generation without reducing the ability to meet the needs of future generations. So if there's overconsumption of common access resources, this is not sustainable because you are essentially meeting the consumption needs of the present generation, but at the expense of meeting the needs of future generations. The resource at this rate of consumption may not be available for future generations. And this is because there's a lack of a pricing mechanism. We said that usually because it's difficult to exclude people from consuming common access resources, the market won't have anything to do with them. And this means that these resources will be overconsumed, depleted, or degraded as producers and consumers do not pay for using them. So the problem of common access resources and the problem of sustainability are closely linked. So let's have a look at an example. If we take a look in developing countries, so countries that are still sort of having a little bit of poverty and still developing, because of the high levels of poverty that are present in those countries, and of course their governments are committed to the pursuit of economic growth, they want to grow economically, and usually you find weak government regulations. So those three things, high levels of poverty, pursuit of economic growth, and weak government regulations, often lead to certain environmental problems, such as deforestation, that's one of them, the erosion of the soil erosion, land degradation, overexploitation of land. These problems, these environmental problems, are a direct result of high levels of poverty, pursuing economic growth, and weak government regulations. Now, a result of these environmental problems is that you have a case of overuse of common access resources. This is number one. You have a significant threat to sustainability, and because of that, this creates a vicious cycle of poverty. It actually becomes really hard to break out of that cycle of poverty. Now, we're going to zoom in on two specific examples, but essentially, this is the main idea if you have a look in developing countries that suffer from threats to sustainability. So let's take a look at the problem of overuse of land first before we take a look at the diagrammatic representation. So overuse of land in developing countries, again, similar to the previous slide, there's a lot of common access land. It's land that's not really owned or regulated by anyone. And in many countries, this land can sometimes be not really well suited for agriculture, maybe because the land lacks certain minerals or the soil is not suitable for agriculture. Over time, the land will become exhausted and will become less and less suited for farming. This leads to soil erosion and in the long run, sometimes even desertification. So that land actually becomes a desert. Now, this is a threat to poor households and to the long-term sustainability of land as a natural resource. In this case, what happens is the marginal social cost is higher than the marginal private cost. And this is because external costs of overusing the land are not taken into consideration by the private consumers or producers. So how can the government respond to this threat to sustainability? Well, maybe taxation, but if the country is already poor, this might not really be the best idea. Maybe by passing certain laws and regulations to prevent people from overusing the land, passing laws that in order to farm you need a license, or maybe subsidizing or providing fertilizers to actually replace the minerals in the soil so that the soil doesn't erode. So these are some strategies that the government can take to prevent overuse of the land. So let's take a look at a diagrammatic representation. So zoom in on this diagram here. As you can see, the marginal social cost curve, which is the supply curve here, is higher than the marginal private cost. And the ideal quantity is to get the producers or the consumers to take into consideration the full cost. So the ideal amount of farming should be Q star at P star, but people are farming at a much higher quantity, which is this point here. Okay, this is a much higher quantity than what should be done. So this vertical distance here between the MSC and the MPC curve, that's the amount of the negative externality as a result of this overconsumption of overuse of the land. Now, what would happen if the government taxes, for example, is that this marginal private cost curve would shift upwards. So it would basically internalize the external cost and bring the consumption down to Q star, which is what the government, that's the optimum quantity. This is what the government wants. Let's take a look at another example that is quite similar to the previous one, the problem of deforestation. So assume, for example, there's a private company that's cutting down trees to produce wood products or paper. Now, because of lenient government regulations, the government's not very strict. This company only takes its private costs into consideration. Now, what are some of the external costs of cutting down the trees? Well, first of all, there's a loss of the forest to future generations. If you're cutting down trees, the future generations have less forest. This could lead to soil erosion, loss of biodiversity because of all the plants and the animals that are dying as a result. Flooding, forests actually help prevent the damaging effects of floods. So this is another example of a threat to the long-term sustainability of the forest as a natural resource. And again, it's a case where the marginal social costs are higher than the marginal private costs because of the external costs of overproduction and the underpricing of the wood products. So how can the government respond to this threat to sustainability? Well, again, taxation is one way, taxing this private company that's cutting down the trees, passing laws and regulations that require the companies that cut down trees to plant trees to replace the ones that they're cutting down, or maybe even issue a law or a regulation that in order to cut down forests, you need to apply for a license. These are ways that the government can respond to this threat to sustainability. Now, let's have a look at a diagrammatic representation. It is the exact same diagram we used in the previous slide. In this case, the marginal social cost curve is higher than the marginal private cost curve, and the vertical distance between them is your negative externality that you want to try and internalize by taxing the producers. And again, there is an overconsumption because this is the quantity here that is being produced of paper or of the wood product, but the ideal quantity is Q star. So you want to bring production down because there's an overproduction or an overconsumption of this natural resource, which is the forest.